This presentation will be by Dr. Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. It is entitled The Letters of Ibrahim Nahum, Reading Iraqi Jewish History Through the Eyes of a Middle-Aged Man. Sasha, please say a few things about yourself and present your paper.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to present some of my research today. Greetings from The Hague. I think we're running a little bit late, not too much, but maybe I'll be brief and I can catch up the time. I am currently the digital curator of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, and I do a lot with digital humanities. And I'm going to start with an apology because this presentation is not as well organized as it should be, because a few days ago I found out that I got an assistant professor position. So as of September, I will be an assistant professor at Groningen University in the north of the Netherlands.
Congratulations.
In the Middle Eastern Studies Department. But this paper today is about something from my book, which just came out, namely using the documents of a man named Ibrahim Nahum, who I'm going to talk about. And before I share my PowerPoint, I'm going to show you the one picture of Ibrahim Nahum which exists. And he's this guy right here. And this comes from one of the archives I worked in. And this is really the only existing picture, but if after this someone says, oh, I've heard of him before and I know another picture, I would certainly love to see it, because I spent a lot of time reading through almost 30 years of his correspondence, and it's one very, very tiny picture. So, share up. And now I have to start my presentation. One moment. There we go. Okay. So this is a very diverse group, and I don't know how much people know about Iraqi Jewish history, of course, but it is something which is very well covered and very well written about from multiple perspectives already. And of course, there's Nassim Kazaz's very famous book. There are many other very famous books. But recently, a lot of what's been looked at, of course, as how Iraqi Jews, during the British Mandate in particular, were part of Iraqi society, right? How they practiced Arab Jewishness, if we're going to talk about kind of the work of people like Orit Bashkin and also Aline Schlafler, or the relationship between Zionism and the Zionist movement with Iraq. And that's when we look at really the work of Esther Meyer-Glitzenstein. And on the far right is my book. And what my book, which just came out, I think 2 months ago, discusses, and this fits into my paper, obviously, is, okay, we know that Iraqi Jews, they were citizens of Iraq. They became citizens in the 1920s. They spoke Arabic. They were very connected to Iraqi society. Many people say they also identified with not just the national, the Watan, but also the Kalmi, kind of the pan-Arab sentiment. But then we can ask the question, how did they see themselves as Jews? And how did they connect to the Jewish world? And I think that ego documents in general, and how we can find these, they begin to kind of tease out this question. And so my talk is really about one set, but I would also say that if we're going to talk about biography, there are lots of biographies which are written by very famous Iraqi Jews. I mean, people know Baghdad et Mol by Sasson Sommer. People know Adieu Babylon by Naim Katan, and The Last Jews in Baghdad by Nassim Rejwan. And then I added Violet Shemesh because I think it's nice to include a woman in this. But certainly the three men, they were all friends and they knew each other and they refer to each other. But if we're really looking as historians, these are all documents that were written several decades after the Jews left Iraq. And they're very much colored by what came after, right? They're colored by migration. And if we look at other biographies, so for example, or statements even by people such as Mir Basri, Sasson Effendi, the finance minister, right? All of these people, a lot of their interpretations are written after the fact. And so sometimes it's difficult to really glean how Iraqi Jews position themselves in this, I don't know, it might be too too long to say liminal period, but certainly in this period of rapid transition. And one of the problems is that we don't have many sets of either biographies written or autobiographies written during this period in Iraq, and we don't have many existent exchanges of letters. And why is this? Well, there was a great deal of political instability, and many documents were destroyed. And we know this because even in the collection I'm going to talk about, the collection I worked in was housed in Hong Kong because it was an exchange between Ibrahim Nahum and his cousins, and also business partners, you could say, in Hong Kong. They kept an archive of their correspondence and actually kept copies of the letters they sent to Nahum and the letters they received from Nahum. But Nahum writes in the 1940s and in the 1930s twice, saying that with heightened anti-Jewish sentiment in Iraq, he has destroyed his archive for fear that it will be seized by the police. So I think this collection is really special because there are just so few existent collections of exchanges of Iraqi Jews during this period, specifically where they're speaking privately. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that collection, but first, who is Ibrahim Nahum? He is kind of, he's in the elite, but he's really your everyday man. He's born, I say the early 19th century. Again, I did this quickly. It should be the early 20th century. We don't know his exact birth date. He is the cousin nephew, right, of the Shanghai and Hong Kong Kadoorie. So Eli Kadoorie, Lawrence Kadoorie, Horace Kadoorie. And he is their appointed agent in Baghdad, both for their business holdings in Baghdad and also to run their interest in the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools in the Mashrek and in Iran. So there's a family connection, but there is also a business connection. And that's what makes it so interesting with these letters, because you see some of them are very cut and dry as business, but others are much more emotional. And that's really kind of where we get into the I and how he perceives what's unfolding. Ibrahim was educated at the Alliance School in Baghdad. He was fluent in French and Arabic. He spoke some English, he could read it, and a little bit of Hebrew, but French and Arabic are definitely the languages in which he's most comfortable. He is a member by the late 1930s of the Jewish Lay Council of Baghdad, and he's also an elected member of the Iraqi parliament, right? So he's both very much active in Iraqi national politics, within the local Jewish community, and then in Jewish transnational networks as well through his role in the Alliance. And the only mention I've ever found of him in the Jewish press actually relates to cutting a ribbon for the opening of the Alliance School in, I think it's Beirut. But he's a recipient of the Légion d'honneur, so he's also kind of part of the French diplomatic scene in Baghdad. And he ultimately migrates to Israel in 1952 with his family. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But the Kadoorie archives also have his exchange of letters with his cousins once he migrates to Israel. And I think if you've read a little bit about Esther Meyer's, if you've read Esther Meyer's book, Ben Baghdad Le Ramat right, it really fits in with that narrative. And it also is perhaps a corrective to Ori Bashkin's book, on the, what's it called? It's something Exodus, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. So the sources. So these letters are held in Hong Kong at the Hong Kong Heritage Project. And it's about 2 meters of letters. And it scans the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Some of it is lost due to World War II and the Japanese I'm sorry, the Kadoories will write in English, Nahum will write in French, and then sometimes you'll see either notes in Arabic because there's not enough, or they're sending newspaper clippings. But personal correspondence is usually in French or in Arabic. And again, it's a mixture of public and private. And I think the private is the most interesting because the public is held in some other archives. But beyond this, Nahum leaves no published work. He never published anything in a newspaper. There is no biography. And as I said earlier, he's rarely cited in the press, even in the Iraqi press, beyond saying, you know, he was present at some event. So what's really special about this in comparison to if we're thinking about Sasson Somekh, and I'm assuming if anyone here has read any of the biographies I mentioned, it's maybe Sasson Somekh or Naim Katan, for example, is that those are written by young men who grew up really in the pluralist Iraqi society, who are much closer, one could say, with Muslim and Christian Iraqi youth. Whereas Nahum is a slightly older generation. He has memories of World War I. He remembers when Iraqi Jews gained Iraqi citizenship, but he also has responsibility for a family, and he has responsibility within the Jewish communities. And so when you see these letters, you really see how he's trying to make sense of how things are rapidly unfolding, whether that's riots in Mandate Palestine, whether that's anti-Jewish sentiment in Iraq, whether that's the rise of Nazism in Germany. All of these things come together, and there's true emotion in these documents, and you see that he's genuinely upset. So I took a very, very small part. And again, I have a whole chapter basically in my book about this. So if you're interested, and I can send you documents, and then I'll just talk about it a little bit. But this is in 1935, and you have Jews who have been dismissed from the civil service, and you have Jewish newspapers coming from abroad, which have been censored and not allowed to come into the country. And so it's certainly a moment of rising tension amongst the Iraqi Jewish community, which is relatively well documented. And he's writing to his cousins, and this is a letter that was smuggled out of Iraq because he knew that all correspondence being sent out of Iraq would have fallen under censorship at this point by anybody in the Jewish community. So he says, "So much for the present situation of the Jews in Iraq. I will report on any further developments, which I sincerely trust will never occur. But before concluding, I wish to emphasize that A, the persecution of Jews in Germany and the publication of unfavorable comments in Syrian and Palestinian Muslim papers cannot fail to have their reactionary effects on the Muslim section of this part of the world. But to say that the Jews have been subjected to any persecutions or to any harsh treatment, as the rumors circulated, is a statement which must be totally rejected, and it is not the least foundation of truth behind it." And what's interesting about this is this comes from a much longer letter, of course, which teases out the whole situation and is very interesting because it presents what I read in the Jewish press, but then he gives the backstory about how the lay council is discussing the issue and how to resolve the issue of censorship. But we know that this is a bad period and that Jews are losing their jobs in Iraq because they're Jews. And we know that Jews are in jail for speaking about the censorship of Jewish newspapers, and that this is a moment of high tension. And he's even aware of this because he has to smuggle this letter out. But at the same time, you see him also being apologetic in the letter and saying that he sincerely trusts that this won't happen again. And in another part, he says, well, it's normal that Jews are losing their jobs in the civil service because there's a new generation of Iraqi youth who have been trained in European languages and they're just as capable. And so we can't forget that Iraq is a Muslim country, and as soon as the larger Muslim population will be able to assume those roles, the Jews will become less important. So it's very interesting because he still sees a future for Iraqi Jews, and he's not alarmist in any way, and yet at the same time, he's very aware of the situation and he's very aware of the political reality, even though his writing at times shows some cognitive dissonance. And I think that in and of itself is just very important in nuancing the Iraqi Jewish experience. And that's why I think this particular collection of letters is so important, because he is slightly jaded, and he's slightly older, and he sees things very clearly on the one hand, but he also sees himself as being firmly rooted in Iraq. And even till very, very late, he has no thoughts of potentially migrating anywhere else. So that's just kind of a little snippet of some of the correspondence and an invitation to maybe look at some of the others. But I want to then talk about kind of what I learned from his correspondence on some bigger themes within Iraqi Jewish history. So one thing is language. A lot has been written on Arabic as a federating force within Iraqi society, and the love that Iraqi Jews had for the Arabic language. And all of this is certainly true, and I think we see this legacy if we read the work of Anwar Shaul and so many other writers. But when you look at it from a man who's in his 40s and 50s with 2 children in school, it's a very different approach. And in the correspondence, he says, well, my son needs to learn Arabic, and he needs to write Arabic properly because this is essential for his career. But my daughter, she really should be learning French and English and be able to write in these languages, because those are the most important languages for making a good match for a spouse. So he's less concerned about Arabic as a statement, as his identity as an Iraqi, and much more concerned about where his children will be professionally, socially. And this is a theme he comes back to very often when he talks about the decline of French, the ascendancy of English in Iraq, and also just the position of Arabic as a language. Secondly, his identity. Again, because we talk a lot about this idea of the Arab Jew and who uses this term. And of course, it's used very differently in the 21st century, but it is used in this period by some specific people to make a statement about their identity. Nahum is obviously not one of them. He sees himself as being an Iraqi, but first and foremost, he situates himself as being a Baghdadi Jew. And that is kind of divorced almost from this Iraqi nationalism, because he's so close to his cousins in Asia, East Asia and the Indian subcontinent. And so he often refers to himself in this correspondence as us Baghdadis, Babylonians, Mesopotamian Jews. Sometimes the language changes, but he really sees this global community. And he really still, when he speaks about Iraqi society, although he sees himself as an Iraqi citizen, he still describes it in terms of these different religious communities, very much defined by religion, opposed to, for example, language or geographic difference. His ideas about Palestine and during the Mandate are very fluid, and the reality is constantly changing. So he talks about going to Palestine in the 30s so that his wife can see a doctor. And he talks about, seeing some Jewish colleagues that he knows within the Alliance network and conferences on philanthropy. And then in other letters, he's very critical of the Histadrut, for example, of general Zionist policy, and he discusses it and how it's complicating the position of Jews within Iraq. But just because he sees this as problematic, he's not ideological about it. He's not political about it. It's just a statement. And he just kind of sees the status quo, I think, existing forever, because even as late as 1947, he's still traveling to Jerusalem for conferences, and he's still writing, and he's even arranging in, I think it's 1946, for Jewish Iraqis whose passports have expired to come back to Iraq. And he's discussing the headache about how he has to arrange all of this. So in him, I think you really see the epitome of this idea of the Jewish community of Baghdad being intemporal and existing forever. On the other hand, as a member of the Iraqi parliament, he's invited to the conference on Palestine I guess it's in the late 1930s, as a member of the Iraqi delegation. And at that point, he has no idea what to do because he's very aware of the reality. He doesn't support what is going to happen at this conference. And so the discussions are artful ways to decline the invitation to be part of this conference on Palestine because he doesn't want to be put in an uncomfortable situation. And we see this discussion with his cousins. And then finally, with the creation of the state of Israel, you also kind of see this ambivalence. And when we think about why people migrate to Israel, and again, these are huge subjects which many people much more brilliant than myself have written about. But what I love about this collection of letters is that you just see one simple man writing to his cousins about how he's interpreting these things. And so he is part of the elite, and because he has the Légion d'honneur, he has the opportunity to migrate to France. And his wife has cousins in New York, so he can go to New York. And I think he also has the opportunity to go to Italy. And this is in 50-51, right? In his discussions about where am I going to go? What am I going to do with my life? And what he explains to his cousins afterwards. But he ultimately decides to go to Israel. And one can't say it's because he's an ardent Zionist. He's in no way anti-Zionist, but it's not a fervor. But his decision is based on the fact that that is where his community is being reconstructed. So although he could have had perhaps more material comfort in other places, he writes to his cousins and he says, ultimately, I decided to go to Israel because that's where my daughter wants to be with her Egyptian husband. That's where my wife can continue playing bridge with her girlfriends. And I know it won't be easy for me. I know I'll no longer find my position. And he writes about this. He doesn't go to the Ma'abarot. He's able to get money out of Iraq via his cousins and have a house relatively quickly. He doesn't suffer in that way. And he builds a very quiet life for himself in Israel. Unfortunately, I don't have any information about him after the 50s. But you really see that this decision is made from a pragmatic perspective of what does my family want? What will be the easiest? How can I maintain this connection to my community? And so as a very small conclusion to this very mini talk, I think we see by these letters that he never thinks, some lady is going to be reading 70, 80 years later in Hong Kong, of what he's going through with someone who can understand him. But it's this beautiful living commentary on the progression of Iraqi history. And I think it's really special. And I hope we can discover more examples like this in archives in the coming years. So thank you for listening. That's all I have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to say something.
Just a minute, Michael, you're muted again.
Okay. Who is it now? Okay, please do. Please
want to ask
question for your comments.
I have two comments. One is for, what was the first one? Asaf Mond talk?
Yeah.
The second one was
the second one was Asaf.
No, I mean that I want to say it's about Avigdor Meiri. I don't want to, after Sasha, to be, like Sephardic and Ashkenazi. Avigdor Meiri published his book because the environment here gave him the chance to publish, because we know that there were a lot of diaries that were written by Jews from Sephardic origin, as Nachmias and other people, were not published, because who wants to know something about Jew from Turkey, what he did in the war? Second, for the Jewishness, the most beautiful book that I love is the book of Stratis Mirabilis, Life in a Tomb. And there is one chapter that's dedicated to Yaakov or Yakub, the Jew that is like Judah ish Krayot, you know, so that they burn every Friday at the Good Friday. So they abused him and harassed him, and all this. He was the only Jew there in the battalion, and he was the hate of everybody. And they didn't know Jew before him at all. That's about Jewishness and the First World. And for Sasha, yesterday I talked about my brother-in-law that have vaginal neurology. Yes, he's from the Nahum family. This, yes. And he said that this part of the Nahum family from Hong Kong doesn't want to recognize the other people from the family that are poor, and they didn't recognize in Israel. They don't give money at all to Israel. And I think it's one of the things of the Histadrut and how they treated their brother here in Israel. So
I don't know everything. There are a couple of Nahum families. Maybe it's the same one. So Ibrahim Nahum has 2 children. He has a daughter who marries a guy named Saleh Levi. And I tried to check it, but if you look at a Saleh Levi in Israel in 1950s, I'll tell you the list is long.
What is the name?
Saleh Levi. Levi, yeah, no, they're like a million. But his son dies, so he doesn't have any sons. I don't know about brothers and sisters of his, but his Kaduri cousins help him out a lot and give him a lot of money when he's in Israel, and they send him food, you know, like powdered eggs and tinned fruit when there are food shortages, and they make sure to get money for him so that he can purchase a house in Israel. So the Kaduris actually do really support him. But there's another Nahum family, and that's because I looked into it a bit, that's not related. So it might be a different family. I'm not sure. It could be the same.